Good day everyone, this is Cooper from Cooper Studios Game Devs, and in today's tutorial I want to show you how you can export your prototype scenes from Godot into Blender. In this tutorial we'll be using Godot 4 Beta 2. I am also going to show you how you can create prototype levels using CSG boxes and also mesh instances. So let's get started. We start by creating a new project. I'll call this project Godot GLTF scene export. Just for naming, let me just say Godot 4, and I'll create a folder and I'll leave the vision control to none because I won't be using any GitHub repository, so I'll just create and edit. So I normally start by setting my editor layout to my favorite layout where I have my resources here, and then I have my files there and also the scene here. So that way I can access the directories and also see the files as previews here. So first thing that I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create two folders. The first one will be assets, and then the second one will be my export folder or export directly, so I'll just call it exports. And then also let me create another one, let me call it scene, where I'll save all my scenes. I will start by creating my first scene, so I'll select 3D scene and then it's gonna create a node 3D, so I'm gonna call it main, and I'm going to save it under the folder scene. I'll start by adding my reference for the player, so I'll click Ctrl A and then search for node 3D and then create, and I'll rename this to player. Note that if you're using if you're doing this on your game, please use character body 3D. So I'm going to add a mesh instance, and this mesh instance will be a capsule, and I'll change the radius to 0.3. Normally the character radius in the game is around 0.3 or less, and the height is also around 2 meters or less. So I'm just gonna leave it like that, and I'll pull it up a bit so that will represent our player scale. So in order for me to demonstrate how you can export a GLTFs as a scene from Godot into Blender, let's create a simple house scene. So I'm going to add a child node, and this time will be a node 3D, and that will be our node for the house. So I'm gonna rename these to house, and then inside of house I'll add another child, and this child will be a CSG combiner. Then I'm going to add a CSG box 3D. So there's also CSG box 3D, and I'm going to scale this on the x-axis to be 6, and then on the y-axis I'm going to scale it to 3 because our player height is 2, so we'll have some headroom for the house. And then our z-axis I'm going to scale it to 4. So let's move this a bit back. I'll press 7 to see the top view, and then I'll also move this a bit down, and I'll move it a bit up so that our pivot point is at this point here. So what I'm gonna do next is I'm going to duplicate this house. So I'm going to press Ctrl D and then again go to this mode and then shift it there. So I'm gonna press 3 and I'm gonna scale this just like that. So I'm scaling it on the z-axis to 6, and then I'm going to duplicate it again, and then I'm going to rotate this by pressing E and then rotate it 45 degrees, or you can rotate it 30 degrees, and then I'm going to move it until this part hits the corner of the other side. So I'm gonna press W and I'm going to move it to that point. So I'm going to scale it again just like that, and then I'm going to duplicate this, Control D, and then I'm going to bring it to the other side, and this time I'm going to rotate it 180 on the x-axis. So I'm gonna rotate it like that. It's actually 90 degrees, so I'm gonna push it until I also reach that corner. So what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna change these two boxes to subtraction, and also this one to subtraction. That way it creates the roof for our house. And then the next thing that I'm gonna do is to create the door for our house. So we can create a new CSG box by clicking Ctrl A and then adding a CSG box. And I'm going to go to the right view. I'll just zoom in a bit, and I'll click Ctrl to position it in the center. And then I will scale this by 2.2 so that it's a bit longer than the player and not smaller than and not longer than the house or equal to the house. So that will create our door bases. And then I'll just click Control Shift and I'll move it until the bottom face of the door is exactly on the 0th axis of the plane. And then I will also pull it out a bit, just like that. And then I'll change this to subtraction, and that way it creates the door for our house. So this is our house. We could go ahead and add windows and other things, but for the sake of this tutorial, as it was only meant to export Godot scenes to Blender, so let's go ahead and see how we can export this house into Blender so that we can add more things to it, like texture it, UV map it, and other things that you could do in Blender. So first thing first that you need to do is to right click on that house node, and then you need to save it as you need to click save branch as a scene. So I'm gonna save it to my scenes, and I'm going to save it as a house, and then I'm going to open that scene with the house. And after that I'm going to say export. I'm going to go to scene and then export as gltf 2.0. So under my export folder, that's where I'm going to put my house file. So I'm going to say save. That way we have exported our house into Blender, and I see that there's some problems there. We can fix them simply by going to this CSG box and scaling it a bit out. And also let's do the same for this one, and let's save it, and then let's go back and save it. Let's export it again. So scene, export as gltf, and then click save, and we want to override. So now let's fire up Blender. So in my case it's already pinned here, so I'm just gonna open it, and then I'm going to say general, and I'll remove everything. So I'll now go to import and then gltf 2.0, and then I'll go to Godot, and then on my export folder I'll say open in file explorer, which is gonna open like that. And then what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to copy this path, copy, and then go back to Blender, and I'm going to paste that path there, and then I'm going to press enter, and I'll see that I have the house.gltf. So I'll import it, and then you can see that it imported everything correctly. So the key thing here is that always whenever you in Godot, make sure that whatever that you are prototyping, for example, if it's a house, save it as a scene. If it's a character that you're prototyping, save it as a scene. Save everything as a scene, because if you were to export this scene, it will end up getting exports with the character or everything inside here. So be mindful of that. Thanks you for watching. Consider subscribing. If this tutorial was helpful, consider liking the video.